Welcome back. I'm privileged today to be able to share with a friend of mine, David Kennedy. He's been a counselor. He's actually worked with hospice, and grief care, trauma, and dealing with people who are emotionally spent at times. And we've been talking in a couple of sessions about that and COVID and how that's impacted us. So today we really want to talk about the emotional, the physical, and the spiritual toll that working in long-term care and the healthcare profession can bring to us. And then how do we manage that? What are the tools that we need to be able to do self-care? So David, welcome, and thanks for being a part of this with us again today.
Thanks, Ron. And I really am grateful for the chance to do this. And I'm thankful that you recognize the need for it. So that speaks a lot about Shepherd Village and the administration and leadership here. So last time we spent the time talking about how healthcare itself creates challenges and the work itself becomes the kind of the crucible in which it can become either helpful or challenging to us. Today, let's focus on what we do about some of those issues as you talked about.
Right.
I think one of the things I've observed, even in my own life, is that there's two aspects to us. There's the part that we are aware of and that we publicly put out there to people.
Right.
And yet, like an iceberg, 80% of us is under the surface.
Right.
We don't put it out there for other people to see, and sometimes we ourselves ignore what's going on underneath there. And we just kind of push on with our public image of who we are and what we're there to do.
There's a little bit of a fear to that too, right? I mean, we're afraid especially to acknowledge what we're dealing with inside, because what will they do with that?
Right.
And acknowledging it to ourselves at times can be a little frightening too.
Oh, very much so.
So we do push down.
We push down, and you're right. It's the fear of the unknown, the fear of what other people will think about us often.
Right.
And I find in healthcare that's a big one, because nurses, physicians, people say to me, I can't afford to show any cracks, because when you're in, and I'll use a critical care situation. So if you're in emerge or you're in ICU and things are happening, you do it. You don't. And if you have any weaknesses, then somebody's life is at stake. So there's a training that puts you at this level of saying, you can't really expose any personal weaknesses, because that affects who you are. So if we translate that into personal life, the fear, one of our own fears about it, but two, what are other people going to think about us? And I mean, I've in my counseling practices, I've worked not only with healthcare professionals but with police and paramedic and fire, and those professions are the same. Very difficult to get to a place where they could be seen as having any kind of help, because that would be deemed to be weakness. So part of where we begin with in self-care is that critical point of recognizing that it's okay. It's okay for me to need to find some support and help in order for me to live well. And again, as we talked about before, I think the pandemic has pushed that outwardly. And my hope is that that's just not something that ends. That people working in this field are exhausted. They recognize they need help, and they're asking for it. So if we can build that into our life, that all of us are, as John Donne said, no man is an island unto himself. There's a time when when we need that support. And that doesn't have to be professional therapy or counseling,
Right.
but developing, and I want to, as we talked briefly before this session, I'd like at the end of our session to really look at practical, how we develop and build a support system that's working.
Yeah, I agree. I think those are, going through my mind, I'm thinking, okay, who have I witnessed over these last 2 years, or even previously, but especially these last 2 years, who's had it all together?
Yeah.
None. Nobody. Right. And then I've also appreciated the push today in terms of mental health and well-being.
Right.
And we're able to discuss and talk about those things as well. And as you're talking, I'm thinking anybody who's dealing with any kind of emotional well-being and health, well, they've been pushed these last 2 years to the limits, unless they have tools.
Right.
And it's those tools that we want to talk about a little bit as it relates to all of us.
Right.
And how we care for one another and so on. So.
The other thing the pandemic has done, as we talk about it, it has legitimized people seeking help. So
Yes.
it's brought it to the point where we recognize, well, it's okay. You're not bad or crazy or weak if you have had to seek it. So there is some opening of the crack, shall I say?
Yeah.
And I'm hopeful that stays.
Yes.
So we talked last time, I talked about the difference between pain and suffering.
Yes, yeah.
So pain, let's talk about mental pain, the pain of struggle, of that, what's going on in my life, the struggle. And pain doesn't have to be physical. Pain can be any struggle that we are experiencing at any moment. That's the one thing. The suffering is the story that we build around it. So the story can be like, is this my fault? Am I just not good enough?
Right.
Should I be? And suffering, one of the words that we find in suffering is should. I should be able to do this.
Yes.
And so our suffering becomes much more intense.
Right.
And because we fight the pain by trying to find the answer in our suffering. Did I cause this to happen? Is this my fault?
Right.
Whose fault is it? So we create all these stories that end up becoming the suffering, and that sucks energy out of us.
Right.
Suffering just sucks us.
When it comes in teams working together, or when you're working with someone else, someone did say to me, and I think it might have been a conversation that they'd had with you at one point. Try to avoid the word should.
Right.
When you're guiding someone else and leading them.
Absolutely.
The word should.
Right.
When that comes on me, it has a negative connotation to it.
Right.
And trying to avoid that. What's a better way instead of?
Well, a should is a judgment thing. Like it's very much you should do this.
You should have, or you should do.
When we say it to ourselves, which is really what happens. Oh, I should have been able to do that. Or I shouldn't do that. So what I usually ask people is, whose voice is that? Who's telling you that? Because somebody else's. All of our shoulds is somebody else's voice.
Okay.
Is it your parent?
Right.
Is it your upbringing? Is it your religion? Is it who's behind that should?
Religion has a lot to play with the
they have
should,
a lot of
right?
shoulds. And I think so, and it may be appropriate, but it should those words cause us to stop and ask the question, okay, is this appropriate?
Right.
So when I'm with people, I mean, when I'm using that word to somebody else is really, that's a dangerous one, and I avoid that. Yeah. So I often use it in forms of questions. Yeah. Do you think it would be, what do you think would be helpful? Or do you think, have you ever thought that it might be helpful if you did, there's ways to the should puts pressure on the person to say, okay, that's what I need to do, or that's what I have to do.
And it's always an external thing when it comes that way. So as opposed to helping them to internalize why they might actually want to do those things, proper things, If it comes from within
Right.
and generating from inside, then you've got
Right.
some sense of well-being in terms of where you're headed.
Absolutely. And again, I think those are the pieces around self-care that become important. When we're constantly being told what we should be doing.
Right. I should be running. I should be walking. I should be eating
I should be
healthy.
exercising.
Yeah.
That may be true,
Right.
but if it's coming from outside, it doesn't have a lot of power.
Right.
And so it's far better for us to come to terms. So when we talk about self-care, and that's where, again, this awareness piece around the first step in any self-care is the ability of the person both to acknowledge that, yes, I need that,
Right.
and B, to acknowledge I'm going to do something about it.
And here's the positive result when I do have an image of something that's positive as opposed to negative.
So that's where organizations who, and it's wonderful, and I understand their philosophy, but when they say to employees, okay, we're going to give you a 15-minute break and you have to go walk,
Yes.
and then they feel, oh, we're doing everything for our employees because we're helping them with self-care, is really counterproductive.
Right.
If they were to say to their employees, hey, we're giving you a half an hour, you can do what you want.
Right. And what do you feel like you might need?
Right, because some self-care might be, I need to just go close my eyes for 10 minutes, right? So there's the idea of this really needs to come from within, and that we begin all that. So again, often the suffering is all of those shoulds, what I'm not doing, what I should be doing, and all in many cases what that does is just further push that whole work underground and to where we need to look at it different. I think the other thing I would say, just as a foundation for self-care, is that we have to, part of that journey is to engage people on a level of again, back to their humanity. So they are, and I hate using this quaint little phrase, but they're human beings first, not human doers. Right? We're human beings. So caring for ourself is our human responsibility.
Right.
And if we can do that, if we can look after our humanity and who we are as a totally unique, wonderful individual, if I can look after myself in that way, it's going to flow out into my work, into my relationships, and everything else I do.
There was an instruction from the scripture from Jesus. Love yourself, your neighbor, as yourself.
Right.
If I don't love myself, my neighbor's getting shortchanged, basically, right?
And how do we love ourselves? And that's and part of that, I think, is living in the realization that we're wonderful. That this is I'm okay. I'm good. And I need to nurture who I am. And nurture that uniqueness about myself. And pay attention to when things get really difficult and hard. I think those are some of the pieces that can be challenging. So, if we look at healthcare and coming back to our setting here, one of the challenges that I think creates, and we talked about this in the earlier session, but the work itself puts us in a position where we can be really in difficulty in our emotional and mental, spiritual state. So again, the work, which is incredible, but whenever we are working with suffering, that impacts us to some degree. We always walk away with a piece of that. So
I can't even watch suffering at a distance without carrying some of that. And the media today, I think we are all right now suffering at some level with what we see. So especially when you're, as you're saying, you're at the bedside of someone who is in tremendous pain. and or just discomfort and
or
there's
lonely, abandoned.
or lonely. Yeah, the feeling of during the COVID, all that isolation and for their well-being, but at the same time, your angst for that person, because as a caregiver, you actually know that loneliness is a killer too.
Yeah. Exactly.
So how do you deal with? So you see that you're there. It's the emptiness. What do you do?
Right. So this is where that whole concept of compassion fatigue has grown. Charles Figling was the one who first started that, and I did training with him back in the early 90s. And the idea of compassion fatigue is that when we're with people in suffering, we absorb some of that suffering.
Right.
And the difference between compassion fatigue and burnout is that burnout is a work-related piece where we are empty and we feel all of those feelings that burnout bring, but it's because we don't have the resources to do what we need to do.
Right.
Compassion fatigue, we feel in the end, we feel the same as burnout, but we don't get there the same way.
Oh.
We get there because we actually have too much. So we have taken on too much, and we are so full. I cannot bear to go sit with one more person.
Right.
And the end result is similar. The impact of burnout and compassion fatigue on a person, similar symptoms, but how we got there are so different. Now, I have had I've trained, I taught compassion fatigue for years. The last number of years, I've had a bit of a switch.
Okay.
And it's interesting to me. Joan Halifax, who is wonderful Buddhist Roshi, who is involved in the States, in California, and I went to one of her seminars in Toronto a number of years ago, where she talked about this, and it really impacted me.
Right.
So here's what she would say about this piece. She would say, compassion, when it's done, always helps us feel better. So you think about the last time you were compassionate, last time you gave somebody on the street some money or did something kind, or you were compassionate to somebody. How did it make you feel? It feels
good.
great.
Yes,
I feel good.
Yes, yeah.
That's not what happens here. So she says, and I agree, it's not about compassion, it's about empathy. It's about unregulated empathy.
Okay.
And here's the piece. Empathy is the ability to feel as much as possible what you are experiencing.
Right.
And that we need empathy. And I think healthcare workers, that their empathy is what brings them into this field.
It's what draws them.
It's, oh, I feel your pain.
Right.
I'm gonna do something about it. Or, we listen to somebody in their loneliness, and we feel that. I mean, I heard you talk about that earlier, and you feel that sense in your own self. What would it be like if that were me? And that's good, because empathy is what it is that connects us. But what empathy should do is that empathy should lead us to compassion. And compassion is this. Compassion is asking the question, what do I possess, or what could I do that in some small way would alleviate, even in part, the suffering of this person? Now, sometimes I've had to say to myself, in all honesty, I don't have anything. However, I think in most cases, I could at least say to myself, you know what, I could spend an hour with this person. And being with this person for an hour and listening and encouraging it doesn't fix her or him, but for that brief moment, it alleviates some of her suffering. That's what compassion does. But then when compassion has to have an end. So when I'm finished with that hour, I have to be able to say, okay, now I have to step back. I can't stay in that. If I try to stay in it, that's unregulated empathy. Compassion is, what can I do? What do I possess? How could I, for a brief moment, help this person? And then I have to step back. Now, I could go back in tomorrow, but that's my choice. Compassion is a choice that we make around how to respond to suffering. But and compassion isn't what gets us into trouble. It's that unregulated empathy where I'm with somebody and I'm feeling their pain, and I go home, and that evening I'm still feeling their pain. I'm still with them. And that's where the danger starts to get in.
And so, and talking a little bit about boundaries, I was thinking, staff, when they go home, when you mentioned about going home and taking it with them, the last thing they likely should be doing is taking that phone call from the resident or family member in long-term care. I'm guessing, because appropriate boundaries and that, it would be easy for me to say, oh, okay, I'm at it, well, you know what, it won't matter. But it does matter.
Oh, it does.
Because it matters to you to be able to set that boundary for your own sense of well-being, and so that you aren't continuously on, as they say. But it's probably also good for them as well.
Well, and that's where I would begin. So if we were having this conversation, and that was the situation, I would probably begin with asking the question, so why do you take that call? What is it that's... And so I need to hear you. I need to hear what that is. And if that is a compassionate response, that's good. If it's an unregulated empathy response, then we're going to have to deal with that. So unregulated empathy leads to a number of things. It can be disguised. So one of the ways unregulated empathy gets lived out is through a moralistic anger. So let's say one of your healthcare workers in long-term care sees this individual and their family has never visited, and you are really angry. And so you start a moral crusade. We're going to get that family in here. This is horrible. And you divert all of your empathy into that moral crusade. It might be against an individual. It might be against an institution. It might be against policy, family, government. I don't know. But and it's not that it's wrong, but you become enraged. And that consumes you. And that, again, those are, that may seem to be helpful, but it's really destructive. The other way it can be unregulated is we can shut down. That's the avoidance side. So we just shut down. I don't want to see people. I remember, and we'll get to that if I tell you the story of my own journey in the struggle. The point at which I realized I really needed help was when I began to resent the people that were coming to see me. And I resented that because I got, and that was, that was a point of what's going on here.
Well, and taking that into the context of long-term care, the last thing in the world you want are people who are actually coming into the job as caregivers because of their compassion, their ability to empathize, and then all of a sudden start to resent the people that they're giving care for.
And that's a huge red flag in this piece of empathy that's needs to be talked about. And people need to know. I think one of the messages that I would like people to hear is the message that your empathy, it's not wrong, it's not bad. In fact, it would be horrible. You couldn't do the good job without it. But we cannot take on other people's suffering. That is not my story. This is my story. There may be a way in which my story can interact with yours to be helpful. But I have to step back. I can't carry your suffering with me. And that's a hard piece. But so one of the things I used to do, for instance, when I did community work, so I would be in the community and I would be in home and I would witness physical suffering, emotional, everything going on there. what I would practice is I would get back out into my car, and I wouldn't stay in the driveway because I don't want them seeing me. But I would drive, half a kilometer away. I would find a place to park, and I would sit there, and I would just say, okay, what's gone on there? What am I feeling? What did I hear? And what is it that I'm going to, and I would do my notes up then, and I would say, okay, what is it that I can do? And what is it, and I would make columns. Here's what I can do. Here's what I can't do.
Okay.
This is my job. This is not my responsibility. And as much as I would like to fix this, that's not my responsibility. And so trying to distinguish is, when we're, so your healthcare people here, and I'll talk about that maybe later, but, when they've come into a particularly difficult situation, I really would hope that they would give themselves 5 minutes to be able to just say, okay, what was that? What did that do to me? And what is my responsibility and what's not my responsibility?
When I started working here, I remember being told, because I came from a pastoral field, and you're
deadly.
and your tendency is to try and fix it for everybody, right? And as I would walk into the CEO's office occasionally, he'd say, "Ron, that's not your responsibility. Don't make it yours." And it was something that I learned. And what I found was it was really freeing.
Thank you. It is freeing.
Yes.
Because we're living in what we can't do, and we're living in that, we're taking it home. What's that do to us? It tears us up. And those are the pieces that...
And I think in the pastoral field where I came from, no one really gave us that kind of freedom.
We don't talk about that one, do we?
The freedom to say, that's not your responsibility. Don't make it yours.
When I talked about the shadow side of work earlier, pastors have huge issues around this because other people see us as the answer people, the one who can fix it, right? So
and got it all together.
And the pressure that puts both on the person and the person's family. You know that as well as I do. But again, those are and if we try to live in that shadow work, then we are really going to struggle in terms of who we are. And I use the word courage in terms of the system needs courage to be able to make the changes it needs. We need courage. And that brings me back to what I said here. We need courage to be able to acknowledge that I need to, in some cases, get some brief help to be able to do that, to say, okay, what's my job and what's not my job. And I think, there's that, I tell people it's kind of like that, we need to have the awareness. I use an ABC model, almost like a three-legged stool. That life is around awareness, and it's around balance, although I don't really like that word. It's more around tension, but balance makes it. And it's around connections. How are we connected? And where are we connected? Outside of work. What can be really difficult with some people is that all of their connections are work. Everything is work. The people, the feeling,
their energy.
They're good, their energy, everything is connected at work.
And they give it all. And then they've got no energy afterward,
And they have no connections afterwards. And they become, and I think, unfortunately, COVID and pandemic has really narrowed that down to where I can only be with my coworkers at work. And so I've lost my other connectors. And that leaves us vulnerable to this self-care piece.
So thank you for sharing with us today. And I'm looking forward to our next session.